Although some historians claim that democracy originated in Greece 2,500 years ago, when a well-travelled merchant called Solon was invited to design a new system of government for Athens, the concept itself has probably been around since people lived together in groups. The evidence of this is clear in most so-called primitive cultures all over the world, many of which have ancient traditions of collective decision-making involving the consensus of a majority, something they're unlikely to have learned from the Greeks. Consider, for example, the United States, the first so-called democracy of modern times, and whose constitution was possibly inspired as much by so-called primitive tribes as early Greek models. The American historian David Stannard has written this: "Many writers, both historians and anthropologists, have argued that the Five Nations Confederacy of Iroquois League, founded in the middle of the 15th century, was a model for the United States Constitution." And anthropologist Clive Kluckhohn wrote about the Navajo people that it's fundamentally indecent for a single individual to make decisions for the group. Given that it's highly unlikely the early Iroquois or Navajo ever heard of Greece, let alone Solon and his political ideas, it's quite easy to see that it's highly unlikely that all democratic decision-making originated in Greece. It's interesting to speculate on the significance of the fact that Solon was well-travelled, implying that he quite probably was influenced by models of good government he had seen working in other places. Tom Paine attributes the following interesting little story to Solon, and I quote: "The answer of Solon on the question, which is the most perfect popular government, has never been exceeded by any man since his time, as containing a maxim of political morality. That, says he, where the least injury done to the meanest individual is considered an insult on the whole constitution." Britain's rulers, the ancient 1%, came only very recently, kicking and screaming against it, to what we today call democracy. Given the fact that this country had been ruled for over 1,000 years by dozens of kings and queens who never lifted a finger to provide democracy, the contempt of the 1% for the 99% is obvious. Consider, for example, the words of the British Prime Minister and supposedly great statesman, Benjamin Disraeli, and I quote: "I hope it would never be the fate of this country to live under a democracy. The Second Reform Act is a bulwark against democracy." Or what about the cynical words of Walter Bagehot, a 19th century 1%er, whose book titled The English Constitution, which, although written in the 1860s, is still used today as the best book available about that mythical thing, and where Bagehot's patrician disdain for the 99% is clearly revealed with these words: "Constitution royalty acts as a disguise. It enables our real rulers to change without heedless people knowing it. The masses of Englishmen are not fit for an elective government." Today, we're brainwashed into believing firstly that we actually have a democracy, and secondly that the democracy we think we have was graciously designed and provided by our great leaders. The reality is very different. The changes that brought about our so-called democracy were in fact forced through a parliament that was openly hostile to them. The so-called Reform Parliament of 1832 merely widened the voting franchise as a sort of grudging compromise, a skinny bone thrown to the peasants after decades of revolt and rebellion by the 99%. And as the words of Disraeli revealed 35 years later, the resistance to democracy by our trusted leaders was as strong as ever. The populist history revisionists who routinely maintain the brainwashing on our TV screens suggest to us that democracy was a gift of great kings and honourable statesmen, whilst routinely ignoring the fact that many of those who truly championed meaningful democracy in this country, such as Edward Despard and Tom Paine, and who are now all but ignored in schools' history classes, were executed or had to flee for their lives from those same authorities who history credits with providing it. Other real reformers, such as Henry Hunt, William Cobbett, William Lovett, and Fergus O'Connor, were all imprisoned for years at a time, and over 500 Chartists and thousands of their supporters were transported thousands of miles away from home, often for life, and countless unknown and unacknowledged real champions of the rights we today take for granted were massacred in large numbers, at Blean Wood, Peterloo and Newport, for example. Indeed, it's a mere 100 years since women were very grudgingly allowed to vote at all. So when the flunkies of the 1% brag that the British Parliament is the mother of all parliaments and a true champion of democracy, they're either being very stupid or very deeply cynical. At best, modern British democracy is a reluctant acceptance of the absolute minimum of the ideals with which really great reformers, the 99% of yesteryear, resisted their rulers, real heroes who were consequently imprisoned, transported and murdered for their courage. It was not the gift of great and gracious leaders. Those people oppressed, imprisoned and murdered the very real champions of democracy, as they still do today. British so-called democracy was simply the very reluctant absorption of a fine ideal by an oligarchic dictatorship that had no intention of ever changing the way it worked, and only grudgingly agreed to appear to do so because of the recent ghostly spectre of the French terror peering over their ermined shoulders. The realization of our own non-democracy is shocking enough, but it's only a small part of the problem. Arguably, the far bigger part concerns how the word democracy has been misused for more than a century to justify the gradual theft of the planet by the newly emerged empire. By the 19th century, the United States government had already acquired a century's worth of first-hand experience of plundering other people's lands by deceit, lies and murder. So they looked overseas and decided to try the model in foreign countries. The following account by Noam Chomsky of the theft of the Hawaiian Islands offers an early illustration of something that's now common practice for the new empire, at the same time as it loudly proclaims its supposed opposition to empire and the interference in other countries. In 1842, when the United States was concerned about British influence in the Pacific, Washington proclaimed their wholehearted support for Hawaiian independence, so much so that it stated its opposition to any nation attempting to take possession of the islands, colonize them, and subvert the native government. However, as the century drew to a close, the US had done exactly what it claimed to oppose other nations doing, but claimed to have done it with democracy in mind, stating that the white man has organized for the native a government, placed the ballot in his hands, and set him up as lawmaker and ruler. In 1893, Queen Liliuokalani tried to ensure that ordinary Hawaiians should also be able to vote in elections, not just the powerful new white elites who controlled most of the useful land. So something had to be done. That was not what democracy meant. So US troops landed on Hawaii and imposed martial law and reported back to Washington that the Hawaiian pear is now fully ripe and this is the golden hour for the United States to pluck it. The rest, as they say, is history. The Queen was forced to abdicate and was sentenced to 5 years hard labour for her crimes against good order, and the Republic of Hawaii was established with American planter Sanford Dole proclaiming himself president on July the 4th, 1894. The story of Hawaii is, of course, far from exceptional. It isn't even especially remarkable. The model of double standards, broken promises, and the military conquest of peaceful civilizations had already been used for a couple of centuries with devastating effect to eradicate Native Americans and enforce the iniquitous Monroe Doctrine in South and Central America. And the strategy would soon be extended far beyond the territorial boundaries of the US to perpetrate mass slaughter in Cuba and the Philippines. Over the last century, the empire has hidden behind the mask of spreading democracy to install its own client regimes all over the world, in Haiti, Central America, Indonesia, Brazil, Eastern Europe, the Persian Gulf, while simultaneously interfering in the elections of many other countries, such as Italy, the Philippines, the Balkan states, Venezuela, or eliminating altogether legitimate democracies that Washington disapproves of, such as Chile, Guatemala, Iran, and Gaza. Manipulation of democracy is not only constrained to sovereign countries. Powerful institutions, such as the United Nations, are similarly manipulated. Decision-making by the General Assembly is apparently democratic, with the votes of member countries appearing to hold equal value. A casual observer might think that those member nations are free to vote as they choose, according to the best interests of their countries. But that's not how the job works in practice. The United States is ruthless against countries whose voting record at the UN has not conformed to Washington's foreign policies. In an important study on the subject, it has been noted that Washington has been computerizing individual third world country votes in the United Nations in order to take them into account when considering aid requests. The rest of the planet is being treated exactly as the Native Americans and Hawaiians were treated, by using exactly the same model of double standards, broken promises, bribery, intimidation, trade sanctions, and military conquest. So it's very clear that the more accurate expression to use in regard to what's actually being promoted by US foreign policies is imperial hegemony.